talking about planets, it's an interesting subject because we're talking about real things located against and involved with real space, but we're translating that position and also the mythological and the symbolic energy of those real things located in real places, translating that into a format, into a criterion that we can understand our inherent energies. And the planetary energies, they don't send down rays to get you to do things, but they also present for our more creative minds possibilities of understanding what these motions, what they mean to us in the deep layers of our psyche. The most obvious celestial body to us here on Earth is the sun. And the sun's motion demarks the course of the day, and our motion around the sun, which we now know, of course, this is a sun-centered solar system. Our movement around the sun as far as our orbital range helps us demark periods of time which we call seasons. And the planets have been, as I said, around long before our consciousness was able to translate them into being places. The word planet comes from the Greek root, planon, or the wanderer. It would have been over a period of about a month of observation where the primitive astronomer would note that a body in the sky had changed places in relationship to what we call the fixed stars. Our relationship in the solar system on Earth is one of a very, very small viewpoint. In fact, our solar system sits on the edge of a major galaxy that is shaped the same as the Andromeda galaxy. So when you look at slides or at astronomical photographs of Andromeda, which is a beautiful display, our solar system sits on the edge of that type of spiral galaxy. And as a result, we have a different vision of the sky as we go through the various seasons. So that as we rotate on our axis, we will see in the course of the seasons a different view of the night sky on a monthly basis. But because the galactic center is located in the 25th degree of Sagittarius, it's obviously in the summertime when we're going to get a better vision of the sky. And then we see a very clear band of stars, which happens to be looking at the galaxy edge on. Now in the wintertime when you look at the sky, you will still see, but a much thinner band of stars. That is a result of looking out of the galaxy through the edge of the stars and beyond into outer space. Now, the fixed stars are the guideposts of all navigators, celestial navigators, pilots, birds. They've come to understand that birds are probably celestial navigators and why they're able to migrate in great masses on instinct, what appears to be instinct. So it's inherent in us to gauge our motions and our movements through life, navigate, if you will, with the assistance of the stars. The addition of the moving planets, or the wanderers as the ancients called them, into our graphs, and as a result into our astrological frame of reference, has added a dimension that otherwise was not there. It first of all implied to us in a very unconscious and very psychic fashion that we are not alone. In fact, that we assume that there will be other solar systems like ours out there. So there's two possibilities. Either we are alone, which is a horrifying thought in itself, or we aren't, which is also a little alarming. So of the two possibilities, both are pretty strange. The concept of being alone in the universe is something that we have contemplated off and on philosophically. And we try and relate somehow something to our unconscious or our psychological makeup to a reference point. And the sun, as I started off by saying, is the most obvious reference point. The sun will shine. The sun demarks seasons. And as a result, the sun is obviously the source of life. The sun is the source of all life. And without the sun, there would be no light, there would be no life. In fact, that was One of the first things that was created was light, and from that sprung life. And so we look at the sun in our mythology. In fact, the god Apollo is very representative of the sun, riding across the sky in a great chariot and bringing with it fruitfulness, creativity, light, power, the source of everything. And so we look at the source of everything in astrology as the sun, as being the will and the vitality of a being. So that when we talk about sun signs, we're not talking about a personality description. We're not talking about the ability to be something or to not to be something. We're talking about strength. We're talking about being alive. We're just simply talking about essence. So that when you were born and the sun is sitting against the backdrop, for instance, of a particular sign, we then say that you were born as a Leo or as a Gemini. Now what that means is the sun is not in the sign. The sun is seen against the backdrop of the fixed stars, against the constellations that are associated with the various signs. And it's very predictable. The sun is the only cycle that you can relate to on a very regular basis. The next one is the moon. The sun's transit of the sky, our apparent vision of the sun, is a very regular motion upon which we have built a very complex system of timing. In other words, in modern times, the sun has become the image for the various time zones. It has become the image of being able to create order out of chaos. In fact, I firmly believe that the way astrology as a subject has developed has more to do with the desire to create order out of chaos than anything else. Now, the order is already existent, and all we're doing is applying it and segregating it and allotting measurements of time. In fact, the whole concept of planets in consciousness has to do with the intersection of time and space and circumstance. So when we're dealing with the concept of planetary energies, we aren't dealing with the ray theory. We can deal with the synchronous theory, the idea that things occur simultaneously with other things, then give us the confidence that there is some connectedness to what we're actually doing. So over the times, the astrological interpretation of the planets has evolved from a very basic backbone structure. And in the beginning, when astrology was just forming and was becoming a signpost, a guidepost for the various kings and czars and Caesars. In fact, horoscopes were not known to be done for individuals other than for countries and for kings. And it's only been in the last 100 years, 150 years, that horoscopes have even been cast for women, because the horoscope was an indicator of a much more cosmic array than the average individual person had a right to. So the meanings of planets is something that has developed over time rather than it has not been allotted. The names of the planets are definitely related to mythological figures. In fact, during the times when the gods walked on earth and when our bicameral mind received audio commands and we obeyed those voices, we had externalized, in fact, our capacity to act and our capacity to think. We have since that time internalized these commands, and they now come from within, and we call it our intuition or inner being. The planets themselves are a clear indication of the desire of our consciousness to relate in some way to a larger whole than the one which we relate to on a daily basis. And you can see that the importance of personal decision has only become part of our daily life in the modern, what we can now call the modern world, because our choices are so multiple. And as a result, we have allotted greater and greater latitude to the indications or the meanings or the mythological backdrop of the planets. Planets themselves have been placed in the sky, according to mythological history, as a result of misdeeds or behavior on Earth. And they were banished to the sky, where they were allowed to oversee people's activities and govern the affairs of mankind. And how we translate it today in modern astrology is we understand that the internalization of this type of energy that we're going to discuss is essential in order for us to be self-perpetrating beings, people who can act out inner commands. And so the purpose of planets in astrology is that we tend to see them now as components of the individual psyche, as we're all recognizable as people and human beings, and our activity levels are of different types. Some of it's passive, some of it's aggressive, some of it's creative, some of it's destructive. Each planet represents a part of our psyche that is an essential part of our makeup. So we like to think in terms of the planets as being symbolic of types of energy that we all share, that we all have, as we share our common features, our human qualities, and our psychological qualities that we all have, except it's different in each individual, depending on many things, of course. One of the most important qualifications of our nature, and that we have to make when we're discussing planetary influences on human behavior, is your hereditary factors and your genetic factors, things that are inherent. So it's very important that we recognize that we are operating within multi-frameworks, within many, many and infinitely lengthy history, and we're reaching back into a psychological memory that has more to do with who you are than just planets in signs in houses. I mean, we could talk about planets as if they were entities of their own, that they don't necessarily have to be in association with astrological signs. And yet any in-depth examination into mythology or into the experiential part of nature and into old ritual, for instance, ancient rites of passage, situations like solar eclipses were clear indications of the gods telling people that major events were about to take place. The moon and the sun represent the capacity to be able to relate and to project. The sun is essentially the center of truth, and as all truth, you can't really stare into the center of it without experiencing some kind of burnout. There's always been a way of exploring the truth without taking on, let's say, the karma of it. And the ancients used to believe that if you stared into the sun that you would die, and in fact what happens is that you will become blinded. Now, no one can absorb a certain amount of information without modifying it somewhat, without having it reflected, without having some feedback. And so that the position of the sun and the moon is one of relationship, of dispensing information or knowledge over a gradual period of time. So that when we have, for instance, at the new moon, we have to realize that the sun and the moon are sort of getting together and having a marriage, so that the knowledge of the sun is being imparted to the moon, the reflective symbol, and then as the moon moves away from the sun, phase by phase, step by step, dispenses this new lunar information. So what we're really seeing is the sun as being the sole source of information, and the moon of being the part of the sky that is the personal representative of the sun, that reflects. In fact, we now know that we're involved in a spherical situation, that these are not disks that are being seen against the sky. What we're seeing are spheres in motion, in relationship with each other, and their angular patterns that they form. And in fact, the patterns that they form are infinitely random, so that we have a series of random patterns, never repeating themselves, all at the same time. But the solar-lunar complex has to do with reflecting what we call the dark side of the moon. Now, the dark side of the moon is an Earth viewpoint. It's a geocentric phenomena. Because if you were sitting out somewhere beyond Earth's orbit, say on Mars, you would notice, if you could see it, that the moon, in fact, during the time when it is dark, is in full receipt of light on its dark side. In other words, the dark side of the moon is not dark at all. It's in fact the opposite phase from a solar system angle than it is as you see it from Earth. So that when we see a new moon, what is happening is what we think is the dark side of the moon, because the moon has what is called a synchronous orbit. As it orbits around the Earth, it maintains the same face to us at all times. It's actually 56%. We see 56% of the moon's surface in the course of 27.5 days. During that time period, the dark side, or the side that doesn't face us, is fully illuminated. And then gradually that light comes around to form what we call the lunar phases. And it was that very ritual that the Druids were so aware of that they could predict eclipses. And they also created various types of ritualistic areas like Stonehenge, for instance. And there are many of these spots all around the Earth that denote beautifully when the sun and the moon will perform particular actions, like the solstice points or the equinoctial points. And it is based on the sun and the moon that all of these phenomena occur. And even today, some of our myths and our rituals that we observe at seasonal changes are directly related, in fact, to this phenomena. So we look at the sun as what? The giver of life, the be-all and the end-all. The sun is a series of nuclear reactions based on a fusion theory. Then what it's doing is generating a tremendous amount of power, sending out sound waves, shock waves, that reverberate throughout the whole solar system and create behind each planet a solar wind, or a tail, that is always facing away from the sun. Somewhere in our minds, in our unconscious mind, and part of our, I suppose, inherent knowledge, is that we carry out the functions of the different planetary energies just on a daily basis. So the sun indicates I am, I will, and I am born. The moon is, how do I think about being born? What am I going to do? What is my emotional, unconscious projection of the truth into the world? So the emotional qualities that have been assigned to the moon are not new, because the moon has always been involved in rituals to do with setting up or establishing a home. The goddess Diana is the moon, and that has so much to do with the fertility cycle and the rites of passage in the whole adolescent stage, that very often the emotional natures of persons going through, say, puberty, are related to moon activities. In other words, very responsive, very reflective, and almost totally emotional, and very much related to childhood and the breaking away of childhood. So that at certain periods of time, for instance, during a full moon, which is mythically just inbred into us, that people who are carrying on during the full moon are under the effect of moonbeams and this type of thing. You know, I mean, the full moon has a fairly bad reputation. And there are also areas of, in the psychological field, where people who work in hospitals for those people who have emotional problems, or who are in fact suffering from varying degrees of psychosis, often have very difficult times during the full moon, and emotional problems are exacerbated at times of full moon. Why? Because the sun and the moon are in opposition? Well, maybe. But it has more to do, I think, with the fact that deep in our unconscious mind is the capacity to relate myth with religion, and spirituality with dreams, and the unconscious mind picks up a lot of images that are related to historical activities rather than just here and now. So when you're responding, for instance, to a person on a purely emotional level, you are in fact engaging what I would call the goddess of the moon. When you are involved in a creative activity that requires only your emotional responses, and where you draw on the unconscious mind, you are operating in a lunar fashion. In fact, when you find that you are out of conscious control and very much involved in unconscious projection, you are in fact behaving in the lunar fashion. In a sense, it's like we're all lunatics at some point or another. We can relate to that, lunar, the very word itself. And that means that you are behaving unconsciously, without will, and in a strictly emotional fashion. So lunar activities are very much related to your feelings. And they relate back to the unconscious fertilization rituals. The moon as, let's say, a representative of a part of the body, rules and has domain over the containers of the body, or the nourishers of the body. So it's always involved in suggestion, in, say, reproduction, in birth, and in nurturing. So the moon allows us to nurture and care for others and to develop their emotional qualities. And the fact that the moon has this dark side implies that there is a shadow. And so shadow ranges in our unconscious mind not as a negative thing, but as a primitive thing. So that when we talk about the shadow in our unconsciousness, we don't talk about evil things. We talk about primitive things, things we don't have control over, that are not well developed. And as a result, they can loom large and, in fact, destroy at certain times our conscious will. How many times do we find ourselves acting out of emotion, acting out of unconsciousness? Plenty of times in the course of a day. So when we're discussing the moon, we're talking about feelings. Now, feelings are different than emotions. Emotions are highly developed projections that are based on instinct, but that are actually very sophisticated. And a lot of people are not really capable of emotional display, but everyone has feelings. So that when you think in terms of your feelings, remember that they are very natural. But emotional display may be created by your environment, by your early home situation, and it's modified by, of course, your parental structure. The sun and the moon typify the mother and the father. The father is the sun, or the masculine, or the yang influence, and the moon is the feminine, the yin, and the receptive influence. And these two forces are very much part of all mystical writings. In fact, we live in a bipolar universe. There is always a polarity to something else, and the sun and the moon are the basis of that polarity, the yin and the yang. Without one or the other, we find ourselves greatly bereft and not whole. So it's important to have both will and force and outward projected energy and receptive energy that is really creative and much more internalized, which is the moon. The fluctuation of the sun and the moon symbolize our ability to go from one pole to the other, from creative to receptive, back and forth. Simply just stated very well in the I Ching as the yin and the yang. And that implies that the unconscious mind is somewhat serendipitous. It just comes and goes, and you're at the whim of your moods and your feelings. So you can have a constant purpose in life, but you can change your opinions as you go, so that it allows you some flexibility, some emotional responsiveness. You are not just a machine. If we had no moon in our charts, as we like to call horoscopes, if we had no moon in there, we would have no capacity for change or reflection or absorption or interaction on an emotional level. So essentially, the moon and the sun are the two prime forces in our capacity to relate to other people, not only what we think or who we are, but how we feel. And we can also reflect other people's energy back on them, just like the sun and the moon reflect their energy back on each other. The moon actually, as a physical body, absorbs a great deal of the light rather than reflecting it back. So we're not really getting the full force of solar light. We're really getting about half. Approximately half of the light is reflected back, which gives you a hint as to how much control you actually have over your unconscious mind. So that what we think and what appears to us to be in our conscious minds is the tip of the iceberg. So the unconscious mind has a great store of information, rich in lore and very rich in our history, which comes through the mythological past. I like to look at the planets as if we were taking a journey, say, starting at the sun and walking outward, heading from the sun to Mercury. Because you realize that the moon is our Earth satellite, but it's so directly tied in with our path here on Earth that we have to consider the sun and moon as a sort of a dual agent. But the next planet out from the sun in its orbit is Mercury. Mercury is a very interesting planet. First of all, from a geocentric viewpoint, Mercury never moves far from the sun on either side, which is why it sometimes appears as the morning star and other times appears as the evening star as it sets. But it has to be distant from the sun in order to experience that brilliance. In fact, the planet Mercury is never more than 28 degrees on either side of the sun from our viewpoint. So what we are seeing is quite a different picture from what really is, which is interesting because Mercury is the old god of messages. He or she, the androgynous concept, moved indiscriminately from place to place, giving out, dispensing messages or information. Mercury functions on many levels. Our mind has the capacity to pick up, to process, to record, file, store, and disseminate information at the same time. This is an extremely versatile concept. So that we look at Mercury in astrology and in psychology as being the part of our mind that picks up information and relates it. So it's almost as if saying, with the sun, I am here, and with Mercury, now I want to talk about it. I want to tell you that I am here. I wish to communicate with you. It's important that I begin to relate my environment to something. And because the sun is the symbol of will and life force, Mercury will never be far from it, symbolizing that your ideas or your mind or your attitudes will never really deviate that greatly from your center, from your will or your purpose. The next planet out from Mercury is Venus. Venus is another inner planet in that it is occupying an orbital space between us and the sun, between Earth and the sun. And Venus, as Venus goes around the Earth in her orbit, because this is a feminine planet, Venus is the old goddess of love, perhaps still the goddess of love, and in our psyches certainly makes up the part of us that needs to relate and needs to find a value system and needs to look for purpose and meaning in life on a very sensual level. In fact, development of ego is an extremely important part of our growth process. And as we go through the various stages of development from birth to death, we touch on each of these symbols and they develop as we grow. But one of the first things that one learns when they're an infant is that they are a physical being. Child in development in the first few months of life, the first thing that they are cognizant of and that they are aware of and that they can actually use is the fact that their hands and their feet belong to them. When they realize what's waving around in front of their eyes at the first awakening of consciousness, of ego, of awareness of self, which is very much a Venus function as well, is being aware of yourself as a sensual and solid being. That is exactly what an infant does, is it begins to recognize, hey, these are mine, this is my feet, my hands. So you can see that this development is quite natural. The capacity to relate is the Mercury aspect by communication. But the capacity to relate on an emotional basis and on a physical basis is Venus. These two planets are never far from the sun as far as our viewpoint goes. Venus has an orbit that allows it to extend itself beyond, on either side of the sun in the sky, about 48 degrees. That's called when it's at its point of greatest elongation. And that means that when the symbol for value system is as distant as it can get from the symbol of reality, in other words, the sun, that there's a whole nother focus that takes place at that point, and that we have constant capacity to check and recheck what our values are, what our ideas are. So the movement of these inner planets, as they're called, back and forth in relationship to the sun, is the ability to focus on an idea, develop an idea, let it get some distance, bring it back home, think about it, work on it. Same with Venus, your value system. You tend to absorb some information, then you have to see if it's going to work for you. During the movement of these planetary energies, there is a tendency for us to do the same thing as people. Part of our psyche, in fact, the Mercury-Venus part of our psyche demands that we understand what this is all about and what are our value systems, how do we relate them. These three bodies in the sky, the sun and Mercury and Venus, are called the personal planets in that they are the identity grouping. I call it the identity trinity because there are three functions to identity: being, thinking, and relating. They are modifiable. In other words, you can do something with your capacity to speak or think, or your value system, or your capacity to feel related, or your ability to develop, for instance, creative abilities or talents, this type of thing. So that these are considered to be personal functions in a psychological realm, in that they can be worked on, you can change them, you can accommodate other people into it, and it is distinctly your unique presence, your personality. So frequently in the horoscope, we'll look at the sun and Venus and Mercury as being the description of your identity, your personal essence. Because once you move beyond the planet Venus, you land on planet Earth, which is sort of interesting because Venus, the symbol for Venus, is the symbol for feminine energy, isn't it? The circle of spirit over top of the cross of matter. And that symbol is opposite to the Mars symbol, which is the circle with the arrow. And Earth is located in between these two planets, which has always been kind of interesting considering the sort of war of the sexes that's been going on since the beginning of time. That here we are walking around on planet Earth, flanked on either side by Mars and Venus. As they do their orbital thing, we find ourselves philosophizing about what Mars is and what Venus is. So when we look at the personal planets, the Sun and Venus and Mercury, we can really see that this has more to do with the development of inner values. But once we go beyond the symbolic and very real orbit of Earth, we head out into the social realm. We then thrust our personal value system, our own concepts, our own ideas out into the social realm to test them. And that takes a lot of energy. And energy is, in its raw form, is a Mars symbol, and vice versa. The symbol for raw energy is Mars because it takes a great and very intense activity to force out ideas and bring them into the outside world and to try and force your ideas on others. Now, that doesn't sound particularly sociable, and yet that is what happens in the initial stages of development, is taking inner values and testing them against authority to see how are they going to take this, how are they going to take that, how will my Mars be able to work within society. Mars itself is the god of war. So it being very masculine symbol in reflection of Venus, which is the very feminine symbol, we have these two bodies which are really antithesis, the masculine and the feminine. Somewhat similar to the sun and the moon, which is more mother and father. But Mars and Venus represent women and men. In other words, the two bipolar genders that we are working with here in this plane. And Venus representing the reflective, gentle, relating, and Mars representing the outgoing, dynamic, rather aggressive, if you will, thrust that it takes to get anything done. Mars represents the masculine aspect of life, which does not imply that women do not have drive or ambition, but it does imply that we are both, that we embody the perfect balance. Each individual has within the masculine and the feminine, the yin and the yang, the mother and the father, the warrior and the lover. And Mars is the warrior. And at some point we reach a time where we have to test our value system and our mores and our inner sense of knowledge and our inherent values, which have come from racial memory, from hereditary factors, environmental impact, as well as our just what we know, our instincts. And Mars, let's say, the symbol for Mars would be getting out there and doing it. It's not particularly sensitive planet, but then you can't be too sensitive in certain situations. You know, I mean, the idea is that if you wish to get something done, you should try and sort of shut down your receptors while you're performing or while you're functioning. If you go out into the world, into the business world, for instance, or you're going out into a situation where you simply have to have some competitive spirit, you would be placing the wrong emphasis on your energy if you were to go out into the business world and engage your moon or your lunar energy. However, if you were to go home after work, for instance, or after your day's efforts, and engage Mars in the home, you would probably start quite a lot of trouble. So the idea is to have everything in balance. There's nothing wrong with being receptive and passive and yin, and there's nothing wrong with being outgoing, aggressive, and externalizing power in its place. So we all have these components within us. We all have receptive capacities, but we also have aggressive capacities. In their own place, they all function, and they function well. And so Mars is the time to function externally, to bring your knowledge of your inner values out into the other world and to test them against the backdrop of society. So that as Mars travels through the sky and is seen through against the backdrop of different signs, what astrological interpretations occur are that according to the sign that Mars is transiting, or Venus, or the moon, during your lifetime, has some effect. It's like the planet is basic energy, the sign is the mode of expression, like what is the personality, and then its location in the sky, whether it's rising or whether it's culminating or setting, further defines the realm of experience that you will act out these various things. Most people seem to come alive as the sun rises. Well, that makes sense. You know, the sun is on the horizon, it's daylight, life begins to wake up and activate. So that when other planets, for instance, other than the sun, rise or present themselves in different sectors of the sky, they too have the capacity to define or modify or express certain types of energy. So that if we have a sunrise, we could also have a Mars rise or a Uranus rise. So the planets that are beyond Earth, in fact, the three planets beyond Earth, which are Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, these planets are considered to be more social because they are the modifiers of the inner planets. These planets represent a much broader range of experience because the inner, the Sun and Venus and Mercury, those inner gods are of the initiatory type, the inherent type. When we move out to Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, we then move beyond an invisible boundary, yes, into the outside world where we will grow and expand and also learn about our limitations. And that will be a very important structure in your life until you reach a point where individuality is discovered and you begin to, let's say, develop something that is more personal, more individual, more unique, more you. As we know, it isn't until we hit the age of about 14 that we even begin to question our identity. And it's at that age where we begin to think to ourselves, how am I going to be able to express myself more clearly, more as me? What do I need to do in order to understand how I can be more of a unique individual? And it's going to mean it actually, what happens at that age is you begin to test your sense of inner authority against all those around you who represent your boundaries and your limitations. So boundaries and limitations are okay, because it's through them that you understand what your capabilities are. So if we see Mars as the thrust of life outward into society, we'd want to see Jupiter, who was Jove, for instance, a jovial personality. Jupiter represents in our psyche the concept of being benevolent. And in fact, Jupiter, as the god, sat on Mount Olympus dispensing justice fairly for all. In fact, Jupiter could always be counted on to be, if anything, a little on the benevolent side. Too much of a good thing is possible, and we've all experienced that. Now, the Jupiterian urge inside us is to give ourselves, as well as our friends, a break now and then, and to grow and expand. If Mars is the desire level, the capacity to generate and to regenerate and to move out and to activate and be aggressive without heed, then we have to develop at some point some understanding of a belief system so we don't ride roughshod over others. And Jupiter's function as a god was to be able to do this, was to be able by divine knowledge determine what was the best thing at a given period of time. So within us, we also have this capacity inherent to be able to judge and to equate and to place on values on certain things, and also to expand and to learn and to grow beyond just the primal urge to be. Now, the whole concept of Jupiter itself can mean overexpansion. In other words, Jupiter, because it implies expansion, expansion can mean too much. There's a point in our expansion, though, where we need to feel some definition. And so that's when we move from the Jupiterian realm, the old jovial realm, into what is called the Saturn realm. Now, Saturn is a planet that's been given a lot of bad press over the last 5,000 years. In fact, it's still getting bad press, probably always will. Saturn behaved in a very unsociable manner by devouring his children in order to prevent them succeeding him or taking his power. As a result, he was banished from, the nice gods. He was Kronos before he became Saturn, and Kronos rules time. Now, time is part of a dimension that is necessary for productivity, isn't it? And time is what? Heals all wounds. Time has much to do with the ability to learn and to create and to confine. A lot of key words that we use astrologically and mythologically, psychologically for Saturn are responsibility, for instance, which comes after a certain expansion of knowledge. It also defines boundaries beyond which we cannot go unless we get to that point and develop some responsibility. In fact, Saturn marks the visual boundary of our solar system. Saturn is the planet which is as far out as we can see with the naked eye. Anything beyond Saturn needs an ocular aid. It needs some type of invention to be able to see it. Otherwise, we don't see it. But they're there. So Saturn represents a very strong, very authoritative, and very confining situation. I tend to see the function of Saturn as being what I call the concept of unattainable freedom. It's like this. You have a project in mind, and you feel that once you get that project done, that you will then be free. And as soon as you finish this project, well, freedom has another meaning then, you see, because what you end up doing is setting up another goal, another boundary. In other words, boundaries are essential in order for us to know how we may go beyond them, to go beyond to seek individuality. Once we get to Saturn, we have covered the classic planets. For instance, Aristotle and Galileo, they only had those planets to relate to. Well, actually, Galileo was a little hipper than the others, him being born at a time of change. though he also had to die recanting his views of a sun-centered solar system, which is kind of interesting. It wasn't really very chic to think of the sun being the center of the solar system. That's a little redundant phrase, until quite a bit later, until after the Inquisition. But what we're coping with from the sun to Saturn are very physical boundaries. You are, you relate, you have a value system, you can be creative, you have an emotional response and an unconscious purpose, and then you can expand and grow and learn by traveling, learning by experience, anything that will expand your horizons, if you're Jupiterian, and then you reach Saturn, which is the visible boundary, but it's also the invisible boundary. It is the thing which you then call limits or restriction or the end. Now, it's easy to see why the ancients were able to survive with those 7 classical planets, because their capability of choice and the availability of the consciousness that we are beginning to experience now was very limited. In fact, it wasn't until really the Industrial Revolution that we were able to make a decision as to what our lives would be like. We were trapped or confined, if you will, to either our mother's or our father's occupation. It was unheard of for the son of a blacksmith to consider being a dentist, for instance. And even in the Eastern religions, and as it stands today with the caste system in Hindu astrology, we have to cope with the whole reality that you cannot cross boundaries. You can't go beyond your caste. You have to be restricted within it. Now, the sighting of Uranus in the late 1700s marked the time that we could then become unique or individual. It was the revolution of individuality. It marked the freeing up of all of us from the restrictions of our parental heredity. So Uranus in the horoscope, or as a god within, represents the freedom of the sky, the freedom to choose, the freedom to become who you wish to be based on your sum and total of experience. So psychologically, Uranus cut us loose or set us free from the restrictions of the past, which is Saturn. The planet that was discovered after Uranus, Neptune, wasn't really sighted at all. This astronomer performed incredibly minute calculations to pinpoint the place of the new planet. And when he set this up and sent it in for observation, said, you train your telescope on this spot and you will see a new planet. And then they found the new planet, and then they went to their labs and started calculating, and it was then discovered that the calculations for this position were wrong. There was a mistake, which is interesting because Neptune represents nebulosity, vagueness, the fog, and also spirituality, so which is not attainable by conventional means. One has to undergo certain rituals in order to achieve a spiritual focus. So Neptune is represented in the horoscope as our capacity to penetrate veils of mystery. We have in our unconscious mind a natural preventative to being too involved with reality. In fact, being involved with reality at certain times is a real negative thing. So every so often we have to abandon ship or leave this plane or become involved in something that will take us away from the daily grind. And Neptune in consciousness represents this veil of mystery that we can penetrate or hide behind, either one. Neptune is illusion. Now, illusion has the unique quality to pose as reality until it has been dissolved or disillusioned. So that when we become disillusioned, we are in fact disengaging ourselves from an unreal situation. And mostly we tend to think in terms of disillusionment as being something that's very sad. So that we go, oh dear, I'm disillusioned, and you know, things just aren't like they used to be. And in fact, it's a much more healthful situation than to be in illusion. So disillusionment is the process by which one becomes more attuned with their reality, which is ever changing. So in fact, at this point in time, I and all of us are operating under several illusions which we are smugly sure are fact, and we won't realize that they are illusion until it is removed, at which time we then think that we are free of illusion, which is ridiculous because we are only involved in more illusion, which is in fact a very creative situation because artists, musicians, poets, all of us in some way project our Neptunian or illusory arts onto the world. Neptune is really the creative planet. Escape is essential. We can't survive without escape. We need to have time off. And we can do that through sleep and dreams, through trance states, through meditation, dancing, anything that actually alters your state of consciousness. Altered states of consciousness are not necessarily, let's say, done by choice. You can't always choose. You can't always opt for an altered state of consciousness. But ever since the beginning of time, whenever that was, or the beginning of your time, when you were a child, you have tried to alter your state of consciousness on a regular basis. Children whirl themselves into frenzies and roll down hills and make themselves dizzy and hyperventilate. Adults have other ways of escaping. Everyone needs to feel different. And Neptune encourages one to do that. It also is the fine line of madness as well. You can have creative illusion and you can have destructive illusion. So working with illusion is a very important part and a very creative part of our psyche. It is, in fact, the center point of what I call the transpersonal planets, Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, the planets which take us beyond the Saturn realm, take us beyond the Earth, and allow us to develop more transcendental and more personal and more unique choices. Neptune, in fact, has to do with our capacity to see religion and spirituality in the most mundane thing, because locked within each person is a numinous center, a numinous being. The transpersonal planets, Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, are related very much to what I call the options, whereas the planets from the Sun to Saturn are like your standard issue. Anything beyond that, you can choose. You can opt not to use your Uranus or your Neptune or your Pluto. You can opt for no consciousness, and you can opt for, for being just part of the status quo. You do not have to be Uranian. You don't have to have an individual style. You will survive without that. However, you do need from the Sun to Saturn your basic structure. It's like ordering a new car. You can have white walls and a tape deck or a sunroof or whatever. These are the options, the extras. They're what give you your uniqueness, and in these days it opts for choice. Now the last planet from the Sun is one of the most mysterious planets because it's only been really in our consciousness since 1930. It was at that point in January, February, right in that time, where Pluto came into existence, was put on our maps and graphs, and we have at that point moved into a whole different global consciousness. Pluto represents the atomic age. In fact, the sighting of each of the outer planets is very representative of a shifting in ages, and modern times has foreshortened events. We are now moving much more quickly than we were in the past. So history, in fact, is being made every moment, but it's so intense at this point that time seems to have sped up. The planet Pluto is the furthest out planet from the center of the solar system. It also has an extremely unique orbit. Pluto's orbit is very much like a comet. It has an inclination to the plane of the ecliptic of about 17 degrees. It behaves in an altogether unusual fashion. It is not only just a planet, but they're beginning to think of it as a binary because it has two bodies revolving around a center point. And they feel that the moon of Pluto, Charon, is just about the same size as Pluto itself. So it may in fact be a binary source. Symbolically, Pluto represents the furthest reaches of the mind. The farthest you can get from your center has to do with Pluto. Pluto is also the capacity to be reborn. But in order to be reborn, I give you the good news first. Rebirth implies that there has been a death. In other words, something has ended and something is being born. Now, the sun is a series of nuclear reactions, and the byproduct of a nuclear reaction is plutonium. And Pluto rules plutonium. It is the solar waste. In fact, Pluto represents all sorts of things in the depths of our unconscious, and Pluto was the god of Hades, or the underworld. He keeps guard over your deepest, darkest secrets. Understanding Pluto is like going into therapy. It reaches down into the very center of you and mines what is very powerful but very raw material that is brought out and can be made into a refined and very beautiful experience emotionally. But without the proper attitude or with unconsciousness, Pluto can be destructive. A very destructive planet. It's the shadow. And the shadow is, as I mentioned earlier when talking about the sun and the moon, the shadow is cast in the shape of the object that the light is shining on. So that any shadow that is looming out of your unconscious mind and involving you in maybe a self-destructive act or involving the individual in what would appear to be self-destructiveness has to do with a very personal inner feeling. And in order to be able to go ahead and rebuild and to refurnish yourself or to create a new sense of consciousness, you would have to, of course, eliminate the old one, because at that point it becomes invalid. So Pluto has a lot to do with the whole rebirthing aspect, just like as he abducted Persephone, taking her beneath the earth, thereby shutting the earth down into winter. Pluto has that capacity as well. We all have it. And it represents in our mind the ability to do this and to remove ourselves from the light and to hide from our inner self. But it's in the facing of it you actually discover who you really are and how you might be more powerful. Pluto is the most powerful outer planet and has to do with social change as well. It's really like you don't have in your life a lot of choice consciously over which way society is going to act. So therefore, you will play an intrinsic yet fairly unconscious role, a very individual role, but you don't really know what your role is in the larger scheme of things. Because of Pluto's time cycle, it's very long, 247 years it takes to go around the sun as it takes us 1 year, you can see that it may have something to do with how society evolves in a long-range way. So it represents the outer reaches of your consciousness and the depths of your unconsciousness. So that polarity is one of the most powerful, and psychologically is the creator and the destroyer in the same sense. So that Pluto is the watchdog of the solar system, sort of circling the solar system and keeping everything in line. So the sun to Pluto is the steps. Now beyond Pluto, we talk about new dimensions. New dimensions that we are not really prepared to get involved with yet. And so the adventure of discovering a new planet, should that come within the next 15 years, the adventure of discovering a new planet will probably coincide with the discovery of a new dimension, either in our minds or in reality. So what we're looking at with the development, coincidental with the sighting of outer planets, is a direct shift in consciousness. So that we can't possibly have seen all there is to see. In fact, there's a general feeling in the last 15 years of this millennium that something is happening out there, and that we are on the verge of a major discovery, and none of us know what it's going to be, and it's a guarantee that whatever you think it is, it won't be. It's going to be unique and different and will open new dimensions for all of us to explore. So we're not finished yet. We can't say that when we get to Pluto, that's all there is, because there will be more.